When Harvard debate champions Marcus Wellington and Victoria Pemberton encountered Filipino exchange students at the International Youth Debate Summit in Geneva, they never imagined their dismissive comments about Third World English would lead to the most humiliating defeat of their careers. What happened when they faced Isabella Cruz and Miguel Torres in the finals would prove that linguistic arrogance is no match for intellectual firepower wrapped in perfect argumentation. The United Nations Conference Hall in Geneva buzzed with nervous energy as 48 teams from 36 countries prepared for the International Youth Debate Summit finals. This wasn't just any debate competition. With representatives from the UN Human Rights Council in attendance, winners would present their arguments to actual policymakers who could influence international law. Marcus Wellington, a 22-year-old economics major from Harvard and two-time Ivy League debating champion, scrolled through his phone while his partner Victoria Pemberton reviewed their notes. Both came from families where debate trophies lined mahogany shelves in homes that had been in their families for generations. "Check out the Filipino team," Marcus whispered to Victoria, nodding toward Isabella Cruz and Miguel Torres, who were practicing their opening statements across the hall. "I can already hear that Manila accent butchering every technical term. This is going to be painful to judge." Victoria smirked, adjusting her pearl earrings, a gift from her grandmother who debated at Yale in the 1970s. "Did you hear them during the semifinals?" The girl said, "philanthropi," with 3 syllables instead of philanthropi. And the boy pronounced controversy, with the stress on the second syllable, like some news anchor from the provinces. How did they even make it this far? Marcus and Victoria's condescension toward non-native English speakers wasn't unique. It was cultivated through years of elite education where proper English meant American or British English, and any deviation signaled intellectual inferiority. The thing about international competitions, Marcus had explained to his roommates before flying to Geneva, is that you're not just debating ideas. You're demonstrating the gold standard of English education. When someone mispronounces nuclear as nuclear or says Pacific instead of specific, immediately their arguments won't have the sophistication that comes from proper linguistic training. Victoria had built her entire debate reputation on what judges called her crystalline articulation, the ability to pronounce every word with dictionary-perfect precision. She'd won 3 championships partially because judges unconsciously equated her flawless American accent with intellectual authority. Their attitude toward Isabella and Miguel had been dismissive from the moment they'd heard them speaking during registration. "Did you catch their practice session yesterday?" Victoria had asked Marcus over breakfast. "The girl keeps saying economic when she means economical, and the boy pronounces schedule like schedule instead of schedule. The judges are going to have a hard time taking their arguments seriously." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It's not elitism. It's about maintaining standards. Debate is supposed to represent the highest level of intellectual discourse. When speakers can't master basic pronunciation, it undermines the entire enterprise. How can you trust someone's analysis of complex policy when they can't even say the words correctly?" What Marcus and Victoria failed to understand, what their expensive educations had never taught them, was that they were witnessing not linguistic inadequacy, but linguistic sophistication of an entirely different order. Isabella Cruz, 21, from the University of the Philippines Diliman, spoke English as one of 4 languages, along with Filipino, Cebuano, and conversational Mandarin. She'd published undergraduate research on climate justice that had been cited by UN environmental committees. She'd won the Philippine National Debate Championship 3 times, and had been offered full scholarships to graduate programs at Oxford, Cambridge, and the London School of Economics. Miguel Torres, 22, from Ateneo de Manila University, had studied international law at Columbia University as an exchange student, where he'd earned the highest grades in his seminars on human rights law, outperforming native English speakers who'd attended elite American prep schools. He spoke English, Filipino, Ilocano, and Spanish fluently, and his thesis on indigenous rights had won international recognition from the International Court of Justice's Youth Scholars Program. Their English, while marked by Filipino phonetic influences, was grammatically impeccable and rhetorically powerful. More importantly, both debaters possessed expertise in international law and human rights, but Marcus and Victoria saw only the accent. They heard incorrect pronunciation and assumed incorrect thinking. The finals topic was announced. This house believes that indigenous communities should have veto power over natural resource extraction on their ancestral lands. The Filipino team had drawn the affirmative position, arguing for indigenous veto power. Marcus and Victoria would argue against it. "This is perfect for us," Marcus told Victoria during their 30-minute preparation time. "They'll probably make emotional appeals about cultural preservation and historical injustices, but we can counter with sophisticated economic analysis and legal precedent. Judges always prefer rigorous argumentation over sentimental manipulation." Victoria agreed. "Plus, with their accents, the judges will already be skeptical. We just need to sound authoritative and their whole case crumbles." What they didn't know was that Isabella had spent 6 months researching indigenous rights for her thesis, interviewing indigenous leaders from the Cordillera region of the Philippines. Miguel had written a legal brief on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that had been reviewed by actual UN legal advisors. Isabella rose to deliver the affirmative opening statement. Marcus and Victoria settled into their seats with barely concealed smirks, expecting to hear heavily accented English delivering predictable arguments about cultural sensitivity. Instead, they encountered something that immediately shattered their assumptions. "Honorable judges, esteemed opponents, fellow debaters," Isabella began, her Filipino accent clear, but her delivery absolutely controlled and confident. "Today's motion asks us to consider not merely the moral dimensions of indigenous rights, but their legal necessity under international law. I will demonstrate 3 key contentions. First, that indigenous communities possess legal sovereignty over ancestral lands under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which 144 countries have ratified. Second, that resource extraction without indigenous consent violates established principles of free, prior, and informed consent that are foundational to international human rights law. And third, that indigenous veto power is not idealism, but pragmatism, protecting biodiversity, preventing conflict, and ensuring sustainable development." Marcus's smirk faded. This wasn't emotional appeals. This was systematic legal argumentation citing specific international frameworks. Isabella's substantive arguments proved even more sophisticated. She demonstrated detailed knowledge of indigenous rights law, citing specific UN resolutions, International Labor Organization conventions, and case law from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Her analysis connected international legal principles to specific examples of resource conflicts in the Philippines, Peru, Canada, and Australia. "Consider the case of the Lumad communities in Mindanao," Isabella continued, pronouncing Lumad with the authentic Bisaya emphasis that no Harvard education could teach. "When mining companies extracted minerals without indigenous consent, the result was not economic development but environmental devastation, forced displacement, and violence. This pattern repeats globally. In the Amazon, in the Arctic, in Aboriginal Australia. The question before us is whether we will recognize indigenous sovereignty or continue colonial patterns of resource theft disguised as development." Victoria found herself taking furious notes. Isabella's examples were specific, well-documented, and legally grounded. Her pronunciation might be different, but her argumentation was graduate-level work. Miguel rose to deliver the affirmative's supporting speech. And if Isabella had surprised them, Miguel absolutely stunned them. "My worthy opponents will likely argue that indigenous veto power is economically impractical," Miguel began, his Filipino accent marking every word while his legal analysis marked him as extraordinary. "But this argument reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of both international law and economic sustainability." Miguel's speech systematically dismantled every argument Marcus and Victoria had prepared. He cited specific articles from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, referenced case law from multiple international courts, and demonstrated understanding of resource economics that went far beyond undergraduate-level analysis. "The philosophical question before us," Miguel continued, "is not whether indigenous communities have the right to say no. International law has already established this right. The question is whether powerful nations will honor legal commitments or continue to treat indigenous sovereignty as optional. My opponent's arguments will essentially claim that economic convenience should override legal rights, a position that would invalidate the entire framework of international human rights law." Marcus felt his confidence crumbling. Miguel's legal analysis was more sophisticated than arguments he'd heard from Harvard Law School students. His economic reasoning was nuanced and well-supported, and his philosophical framing revealed deep engagement with political theory that made Marcus's prepared arguments seem shallow by comparison. When Marcus rose to deliver the negative team's first rebuttal, he faced a challenge he'd never encountered. Opponents whose arguments were so substantively strong that attacking their pronunciation would make him look intellectually bankrupt. "My worthy opponents have presented compelling examples," Marcus began, his famous Harvard confidence now sounding hollow. "However, they failed to address the economic reality that many indigenous communities exist in poverty specifically because they lack access to economic development opportunities that resource extraction could provide." It was a weak argument, and everyone in the room knew it. Marcus had relied on linguistic authority his entire debate career. When his arguments were challenged, his perfect American accent had always carried him through. But against Isabella and Miguel's substantive expertise, his accent meant nothing. Victoria's rebuttal speech proved equally inadequate. Despite her crystalline pronunciation and extensive vocabulary, her arguments revealed shallow understanding of the legal and economic issues at stake. "Our opponents romanticize indigenous communities," Victoria argued, her tone patronizing. "But the reality is that indigenous veto power would trap these communities in poverty, denying them the economic progress that resource development brings." It was exactly the kind of colonial paternalism that Isabella had predicted they'd employ. Isabella's closing arguments systematically dismantled every point Marcus and Victoria had made, while reinforcing the affirmative case with additional legal precedent and economic evidence they hadn't even used in their opening. "Our opponents claim that indigenous veto power would trap communities in poverty," Isabella said, her voice rising with controlled passion. "But this argument reveals the exact colonial mindset that international human rights law was designed to dismantle. Indigenous communities are not children who need American or European guidance on how to use their own lands. They are sovereign peoples with legal rights that our opponents find inconvenient." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "My opponents essentially argue that indigenous peoples should be forced to accept environmental destruction for their own good. This is not economic analysis. It's colonial ideology dressed in economic language. And it has no place in international law." The room was absolutely silent. Miguel's final speech connected their specific arguments to broader principles of self-determination, environmental justice, and international law, demonstrating the kind of synthetic thinking that separated exceptional debaters from merely competent ones. "The choice before us," Miguel argued in his closing statement, his Filipino accent now sounding like a mark of authenticity rather than inadequacy, "is not between economic development and indigenous rights. It is between respecting international law or continuing the historical pattern of treating indigenous sovereignty as negotiable." Our opponents' arguments would render meaningless every international human rights instrument developed over the past 75 years. He looked directly at Marcus and Victoria. "And their arguments would be wrong regardless of what accent they were delivered in." The judges deliberated for 15 minutes, an unusually long time, suggesting serious discussion. When they returned, the chief judge, Dr. Amara Okafor from the Nigerian delegation to the UN Human Rights Council, made an announcement that would haunt Marcus and Victoria for years. "This decision is unanimous in favor of the affirmative team, but more significantly, we feel compelled to address something we observed during this debate." She paused, looking directly at the American team. The affirmative team, Isabella Cruz and Miguel Torres from the Philippines, demonstrated exceptional command of international law, sophisticated economic analysis, and rigorous logical argumentation. Their knowledge of UN human rights instruments exceeded that of many legal professionals I work with at the United Nations. Another pause. The negative team, Marcus Wellington and Victoria Pemberton from Harvard, presented arguments that, while delivered in flawless American English, revealed superficial understanding of the legal and ethical issues at stake. More concerning, we observed body language and facial expressions suggesting they were surprised by their opponent's intellectual sophistication. Dr. Okafor's voice became firmer. "Let me be clear. Accent has nothing to do with intelligence. The Filipino team spoke what linguists call World English, perfectly correct English that reflects their unique cultural and linguistic background. Their pronunciation is no more wrong than an Australian accent or a Scottish accent. What we judged today was not who sounded more American, but who understood international law better. And on that measure, the Filipino team demonstrated clear superiority." Marcus felt his face burning. Victoria stared at her hands. Judge Antonio Morales from the Spanish delegation added, "I've been judging international debates for 15 years. The affirmative team's analysis of indigenous rights law was graduate-level work. They didn't just win this debate, they elevated it. Meanwhile, the negative team seemed to have underestimated their opponents, perhaps due to linguistic prejudice. That was a costly mistake. The post-debate reception was excruciating for Marcus and Victoria. Other teams and judges made pointed comments about the American team's performance, or more specifically, their obvious shock at losing. "Your opponents were brilliant," Professor James Chen from Berkeley told Marcus. "I've been judging these competitions for 2 decades. Isabella's knowledge of UN human rights law was extraordinary. Did you expect her to be less knowledgeable because of her accent?" Marcus had no answer. Victoria faced similar feedback from multiple sources. One judge from the French delegation was particularly direct. "The Filipino team's legal arguments were exceptional. Your team seemed unprepared for their sophistication." "May I ask why?" The most painful moment came when Dr. Sarah Williams, a Yale linguistics professor who had judged the finals, approached them directly. "I couldn't help noticing your surprise when you lost," Dr. Williams said diplomatically but firmly. "Many American students struggle in international competition because they confuse linguistic variety with linguistic inadequacy. Those Filipino debaters spoke world English perfectly, English that reflects their cultural background while maintaining complete grammatical and rhetorical sophistication. Their accent no more undermines their intelligence than a Texas accent or a Boston accent undermines an American debater." She leaned in slightly. "Can I give you some advice? In international settings, linguistic diversity is a sign of sophistication, not inadequacy. People who speak multiple languages and code switch between them demonstrate cognitive flexibility that monolingual speakers often lack. Isabella and Miguel didn't win despite their accents. They won because their education, research, and intellectual rigor exceeded yours." Marcus and Victoria's humiliation deepened as they learned more about their opponents' backgrounds. Isabella Cruz had been accepted to doctoral programs at Oxford, Harvard, and Yale, ultimately choosing Oxford because of their stronger program in international human rights law. She'd turned down full scholarships because the University of the Philippines offered her the opportunity to research indigenous rights in her own country, work she considered more meaningful than attending a prestigious Western university. Miguel Torres had received the highest marks in his Columbia Law School seminars during his exchange year, outperforming American students who'd attended elite prep schools. 3 professors had written him recommendation letters calling him the most brilliant legal mind they'd encountered in their careers. He'd been offered positions at major international law firms, but chose to return to the Philippines to work with indigenous communities. "We completely underestimated them," Victoria admitted to Marcus as they sat in their hotel room that evening, processing their defeat. "I assumed their pronunciation meant they weren't as sophisticated as us intellectually. But they knew more about international law than we did. They understood economic theory better than we did. They presented more rigorous arguments than we did." Marcus nodded, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "We judged them by their accents and ignored their ideas. They judged our arguments on their merits and found them wanting. We deserved to lose. But it was worse than just losing a debate. Their prejudice had been publicly exposed in front of UN officials, international judges, and fellow debaters from 36 countries. The video of the debate, including the judges' comments about linguistic prejudice, would be published on the summit's website for educational purposes. Their humiliation would be permanent. Over the following months, both Marcus and Victoria made genuine efforts to address the prejudices that had led to their embarrassing defeat. Marcus began taking courses on post-colonial studies and international development, discovering vast bodies of scholarship produced by non-Western intellectuals, whose work he'd never encountered despite years of elite education. He realized that his Harvard education, while prestigious, had given him a remarkably narrow view of global intellectual discourse. He also started volunteering with an organization that supported international students at Harvard, learning to appreciate the intellectual contributions of scholars, whose accents marked them as outsiders to traditional American academic culture. Victoria used her linguistics background to research how English had evolved as a global language, discovering that there are more non-native English speakers in the world than native speakers, and that correct English is actually a colonial construct designed to maintain linguistic hierarchy. She learned that the incorrect pronunciations she'd mocked like schedule for schedule, were actually closer to the word's original British pronunciation before American English standardized schedule. What she dismissed as wrong was often just different. Both debaters also joined Harvard's chapter of Global Debate Initiative, which worked to make international debate competitions more accessible to students from non-Western countries, and to combat linguistic prejudice in competitive academics. A year later, Marcus and Victoria encountered Isabella and Miguel again at the Oxford International Debate Championship. This time, instead of dismissing their opponents based on linguistic prejudice, they prepared rigorously for what they knew would be intellectually challenging competition. Before the debate, Marcus approached Isabella privately. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere. "My behavior at Geneva was arrogant and prejudiced. You taught me that accent has nothing to do with intelligence, and that linguistic diversity is a sign of sophistication, not inadequacy. I'm sorry for underestimating you." Isabella's response was gracious but pointed. "I appreciate your apology, Marcus, but the real issue isn't personal prejudice. It's systemic assumptions about whose voices deserve to be heard and whose ideas deserve serious consideration. Every day, people with Filipino accents, or Indian accents, or Nigerian accents, or any non-Western accent, have their intelligence questioned because they don't sound like you. International debate should celebrate intellectual diversity, not just tolerate it," Miguel added. "We've encountered linguistic prejudice throughout our academic careers. Not just from American students, but from speakers of dominant varieties of English everywhere. The assumption that accent determines intelligence is a global problem that limits everyone's learning opportunities. When you dismiss someone's ideas because of how they sound, you might be missing the most brilliant insights you'll ever hear." The rematch proved far more competitive. Marcus and Victoria had genuinely improved, not just in their argumentation, but in their respect for their opponent's intellectual contributions. While Isabella and Miguel won again, the margin was much closer, and the debate was characterized by genuine intellectual exchange rather than cultural condescension. "That was the debate we should have had at Geneva," Victoria told Miguel after their second encounter. "When we focused on engaging with your arguments instead of dismissing your accents, we all performed at a higher level. I learned more from losing to you respectfully than I ever learned from winning against opponents I underestimated." 5 years later, both Marcus and Victoria had completed graduate degrees that included substantial focus on global perspectives and post-colonial studies. Marcus became an international human rights lawyer, working specifically on indigenous rights cases, the very topic where Isabella and Miguel had demolished him. He often cited their Geneva debate as the moment he realized his elite education had given him knowledge without wisdom. "That defeat was the best thing that happened to my intellectual development," Marcus reflected during an interview about international education. "I learned that true linguistic sophistication means appreciating the full range of human expression, and that real intellectual authority comes from the quality of ideas rather than the accent in which they're delivered." Isabella and Miguel didn't just beat me in a debate. They taught me to listen to voices I'd been trained not to hear. Victoria pursued a PhD in applied linguistics, focusing specifically on linguistic prejudice in international academic settings. Her research documented how accent-based discrimination limited intellectual exchange and reinforced colonial hierarchies in global education. "We thought we were defending standards of excellence," Charlotte reflected in her dissertation. "But we were actually defending barriers to excellence." Isabella and Miguel didn't just beat us in debate. They taught us that excellence has many voices, and the most beautiful arguments often come from those whose pronunciation we've been trained not to recognize as authoritative. Both credited their defeat to Isabella and Miguel as a crucial turning point in their intellectual and personal development. The debate that had initially humiliated them had ultimately liberated them from limiting assumptions about intelligence, authority, and cultural value. Isabella and Miguel's victory at Geneva became part of training materials used by international debating organizations to address linguistic prejudice and cultural bias in competitive academics. The Geneva lesson, as it became known, demonstrated how assumptions about accent and intelligence could blind competitors to substantive intellectual challenges, and how those assumptions could lead to devastating defeats when opponents' ideas proved superior to your prejudices. The International Youth Debate Summit implemented new judge training that specifically addressed linguistic bias, teaching judges to evaluate arguments based on substance rather than accent. They also created a diversity initiative that provided scholarships and support for debaters from non-Western countries. Isabella and Miguel continued their academic success, both becoming professors whose research on indigenous rights and international law influenced policy discussions at the United Nations and shaped academic curricula worldwide. The debate with Marcus and Victoria taught them something important too. It showed us that intellectual humility can overcome cultural prejudice, Isabella reflected during an interview about her career, and that the most meaningful victories come not just from winning, but from changing minds. Marcus and Victoria could have resented us forever. Instead, they learned from their defeat and became advocates for the very communities they'd once dismissed. That's more important than any debate trophy, Miguel added. The most eloquent arguments aren't always delivered in the most familiar accents. And the greatest intellectual victories come when we help others realize they've been listening to voices instead of hearing ideas. Marcus and Victoria heard our accents first, but eventually they heard our arguments. That's what education is supposed to do. This story isn't just about debate. It's about every Filipino call center worker whose technical expertise is dismissed because of their accent. It's about every Filipino nurse whose medical knowledge is questioned because they pronounce words differently. It's about every Filipino engineer, teacher, developer, and professional who has been underestimated because English in the Philippines sounds different from English in America or Britain. The Philippines is the third largest English-speaking country in the world. Filipino professionals consistently rank among the most skilled in their fields globally. The country produces doctors who pass American medical boards at higher rates than American graduates, engineers who design systems for Silicon Valley, teachers who educate students across 6 continents. And yet, the accent, that beautiful linguistic marker of a culture that has mastered multiple languages, that has transformed English into something uniquely Filipino while maintaining its grammatical sophistication, becomes a barrier to recognition. This has to change. What did you think of Marcus and Victoria's humbling lesson about linguistic prejudice versus intellectual excellence? Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination based on accents or language varieties, only to see intellectual merit triumph over prejudice? And remember, the next time you hear an unfamiliar accent, listen more carefully. You might be hearing ideas that could change your understanding of the world. The most profound truths often come from voices we haven't learned to recognize as authoritative. Until next time, keep your ears open to the wisdom that speaks in every variety of human language. Every Filipino needs to see this. Every person needs to hear it.